Welcome to the Finding Financial Freedom podcast with the Frugal Physician, where Dr. Disha Spath will be your companion on this exciting financial adventure. Get ready to conquer debt, build wealth, and embrace a mindful spending lifestyle that will empower you to live life on your own terms.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Finding Financial Freedom podcast with the Frugal Physician. I'm your host, Dr. Disha Spath. We're very lucky to have today's guest on. As the founder and CEO of Student Loan Planner, Travis has consulted on a staggering $800 million of student loan debt, more than anyone else in the country. Travis has a BS in statistics and a BA in economics from the University of Florida, as well as his certified financial planner certification and chartered financial analyst designation. Before he started the Student Loan Planner in 2016, Travis retired in 2015 at the age of 25 and traveled to 36 countries to further educate himself on all things finance, blogging, running a website, and more. Travis was also a bond trader for one of the world's largest investment companies, Vanguard, managing municipal bond funds. In addition, he authored 2 books on financial independence and money management, Managing Your Money in Your 20s and 30s, and 25 is the New 65, How to Retire Outrageously Early and Do Whatever the Heck You Want. Please welcome Travis Hornsby, CFA, CFP, and founder of the Student Loan Planner. Thanks for joining us, Travis.
Hey, Disha, the thing that's crazy is there's a lot of really embarrassing stuff in some of those books that I wish I could unwrite. I mean, you learn a lot in your 30s that you wish you knew in your 20s. Am I right?
For real. I felt like I knew everything in my 20s, and as I age, I realized that how little I know and how much more I need to learn.
Oh, yeah. And it's kind of fun also getting to talk to very educated professionals like you, like my wife, who's also a physician, because I always joke that I'm the least educated person in the room, usually when I'm with
I doubt that.
my bachelor's degree, but I've been able to use it as well as I can. So excited to talk today about a lot of just things that are probably on people's minds, I bet.
Yeah, Travis, I think you're definitely selling yourself short. You have a lot of accomplishments, and the first time we met was way back in 2019, I think at the first FinCon, and how things have changed since then and how many people you've helped since then. Travis, I want to really dive into your journey because there's so much in your background that is intriguing, but could you give us a quick summary of how you got into the student loan advising space and how you got here to where you are today?
I mentioned my wife being a physician. So when we started dating, she had 6 figures of student debt. And I thought, oh, wow, like I model, a lot of complex bond positions and spreadsheets all day. So this should be easy, right? Just make an amortization schedule and look at an option that's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, decide how much we want to pay on this. And that's it. But then I realized, oh, wait a second, there's this thing called public service loan forgiveness, right?
Mhm.
And then there's this thing called paying based on your income. And there's this thing called FFEL loans, which is loans that were taken out before 2010. And then there's things called direct loans, which are different. And the direct loans qualify and the FEL loans do not qualify. And I was like, this is really complicated.
There's so much
So
minutia.
yeah, so I made a spreadsheet with the skills that I developed, doing the bond trading and then modeled like the best path for us. My wife was like, you should talk to our friends about this because we a lot of friends were in Philadelphia. So like everybody we knew at the time was like in grad school or had grad school loans or was just finishing up grad school. And so she was like, you should charge for it. This is very valuable. So I just used that spreadsheet that I built for her with other people, just sort of like coaching them what's the best, most optimal way to pay it back.
Yeah.
And that kind of really picked up after I quote unquote retired. I really did think in my head, oh, well, I'm retired because it felt like I was. But in retrospect, really what I was looking for was a sabbatical, which I think is distinct and very valuable. And I think actually a lot more people should be open to a sabbatical than
Absolutely.
who use it, because I think that what happens is a lot of people get burned out
Yeah.
and a lot of people just get tired. And sometimes you just need a little bit of time away to just like recharge your batteries. That's what I did. And I recharged my batteries and then just had time to sort of mess around with doing different things. The student loan stuff just sort of fell into my lap because it was just by far the most successful thing that I was working on. And I started doing it actually in the Obama administration, did student loan advice throughout the first Trump administration and then the Biden administration and then back into now the second Trump administration. So, I've seen a lot of different things happen in student loans, which I think is helpful for people that are currently on that journey or who maybe knows somebody on that journey?
Yes, yeah, the politics so play into student loan management and how we need to be handling things, and there have been so many new things that come out in each administration. So let's go back and recap. So back in 2019 when we met, it was the first Trump administration. If I recall, before 2020, the numbers were still very dismal for PSLF, even though it was available passed in 2007. It seemed that there were many ways that people could disqualify from getting PSLF, and only about 1% of the people eligible for PSLF were actually getting it. So tell me what happened in the Trump administration and then how Biden changed things.
So this is really fascinating to talk about because like politics, like you said, do have a really intense impact on everything student loans because I don't know any debt that you can pay a percent of your income and then get the rest forgiven. That's like very unusual. The way to know about PSLF and the state of it is to go back to when it was written, which was in 2007. So in 2007, the President Bush administration worked with House Democrats to craft the PSLF program originally. I know some of the people that wrote that bill, and they were very intentional to create it in a defective way. The reason for that is if the vast majority of debt at the time was FFEL debt, it was before the financial crisis, right? And
Mhm.
so if they had included FEL debt in what was eligible for PSLF at the time, then they would have gotten a ton of lobbyists pushback, like from Sally Mae, which at the time was very powerful. And other FEL lenders, right, the state guarantee agencies, they would have pushed back hard and killed the bill in its tracks. And so the direct loan program was a small subset of loans at the time. And so they said, well, let's make it so that PSLF only counts for direct loans. And let's leave all of the FEL loans out because that CBO score, CBO is the nonpartisan budget kind of scorekeeper that scores how expensive bills are. They had to have that number come in at a very low number because if
Okay.
that number was really high, Congress has to do something called pay fors, which means you have to either increase taxes or decrease spending elsewhere. So it's very intense to have a CBO score that comes in very high. Now, if you make a flawed CBO score and then you figure out your way to backdoor into a lot of forgiveness later, that does not have to be paid for. So effectively, the very smart congressional staff on the Democratic side said, let's make a very flawed bill because it's what we can get passed. And let's count on being able to eventually get a bunch forgiven in the future. And so what happened is in 2010 or 2009 kind of time frame when you had the first Obama administration, they passed the Affordable Care Act. As part of the Affordable Care Act, they actually said that they were going to help pay for the Affordable Care Act by nationalizing the student loan industry. So they were going to take all that FEL debt instead of the interest going to the guarantee agencies and those private lenders. All of
Mhm.
that interest was instead going to go towards the government instead because they were going to eliminate the FEL program and have only direct loans beyond that point. So that was 2010 basically.
Mhm.
And the thing is anybody before 2010 had this old kind of loan that didn't count for PSLF unless you consolidated it. That was like a backdoor way to qualifying. And it's very true the servicers did not accurately tell people the truth about needing to consolidate and how that had to happen to qualify and that they had the wrong kind of loans and such, right? But the issue is, servicers do not have a fiduciary duty to borrowers. There's no legal requirement that they do that, right? I mean, it's not good behavior. It's not right. And there's plenty of servicers told people completely inaccurate information that they did qualify when they didn't. But the reality is you would have had to qualify in 2020. You would have had to have immediately consolidated your loans when they have this new backdoor way to qualify for direct loans and PSLF. So you would have had to know day one, consolidate in the middle of 2010 into direct loans and then pay based on your income for 10 years after that. And then
Mhm.
you would have been eligible in 2020. So, in other words, the very first batch of people, period, that could have been eligible for PSLF would have been eligible in 2020. And the very first batch of people from medical school that could have been eligible for PSLF without having to consolidate would have been people who probably the class of 2014. And the reason I say that is most people who started medical school, like say in 2008, might have had 2008 and 2009 as FEL loans, 2010, 2011 as direct loans, right? So you
Yes.
would have had one type of loans that did qualify, one type that didn't, and you would have had to consolidate all of them at graduation. So the
Yeah.
first group of people that actually would have had loans that they would have qualified for PSLF without doing anything would have been that class of 2014, which add 10 years, that would be 2024. Effectively, the program was built to fail intentionally because of CBO rules, and the sort of Democratic staffers that wrote the bill know that, but that's very technical, that's very jargony, that's
Hmm.
very kind of like inside baseball politics kind of stuff about just the way the world works. And so it's way easier to say, "This is a broken program, we have to fix it right now." That was part of the plan. They knew it was gonna fail, they knew it was gonna have problems, and then they were using the fact that it was broken to try to move the line a little bit more, right? To try to get more accomplished. And so the first Trump administration did not have PSLF high on their priority list at all. I will say that it was higher than some things, like getting loans forgiven if you went to a for-profit school, for example, was even harder during that
Yeah.
first Trump administration than getting PSLF. But what happened is Biden took that like exponentially increasing numbers that people would have gotten with PSLF because of those direct loans being taken out like in greater numbers every single year. So that exponential approval rate would have happened if Trump had won re-election. It would have happened, but it wouldn't have happened as much as what Biden did, because what Biden did is he just said, well, we're going to count any kind of loan, any kind of repayment, any kind of non-repayment. All you got to do is consolidate if it's not direct loans, and then we'll apply automatically if it's direct loans. You just need to tell us about all your previous payments, and we're going to count any employment credit as if you've been paying on that for the whole balance. So, for example, we had some people that did Teach for America before medical school. They were able to get those 2 or 3 years accounted for on their med school loans, even though they didn't have the med school loans taken out when they were doing Teach for America, if that makes sense. That was
Wow.
called the PSLF waiver. So that's really the
Yes.
thing that Biden did that transformed everything, and that was an executive action. So Biden effectively did this transformational executive action that got 1 million people through PSLF during his 4 years, which is definitely a major accomplishment in terms of getting something actually done, and also got millions more people a lot closer to forgiveness than they otherwise would have been.
Right. So that's a very important point. By the way, I was one of those people that consolidated in 2010 because I was looking towards PSLF, but it didn't look like it was a probable thing that would happen. And part of it was because there were so many people that were having trouble with their payment counts and their employer certifications and getting their stuff in on time. And people had to, you couldn't make a late payment. If something happened and they didn't process your payment right and whatever, and then you wouldn't qualify, there were a lot of barriers to getting forgiveness back then. And it only seemed to get worse in the Trump administration. But like you said, when Biden came in and he did pass through executive action and not through the Congress, this PSLF waiver that we were all, very, very passionate about telling our followers about because it was so advantageous, right, to people that could get PSLF. Even people that wouldn't have qualified before could now qualify. There were so many positive things for student loan borrowers. What are the main options available? Because there have also been changes in the actual payment plans during this time. Before Biden, there were four major income driven repayment plans. Can you tell us what they were?
Yeah, pay, ICR, repay, and IBR. And then he replaced the repay plan with save plan and claimed that it was better for everyone. There is some talk that they might reopen the ICR and the pay plans in the last months of the Biden administration, but we will wait and see on that. So right now, theoretically, there's really two plans, save and income-based repayment, IBR.
So those 4 plans, for physicians, it was important to know which one had a captive payment, which one didn't. And Repay had some subsidy for the unpaid interest, which was nice, which was passed under Obama. And then Biden went further to completely 100% eliminate all the unpaid interest in SAVE. So Pay and ICR were kind of out of the picture for physicians, except for certain situations. Can you tell me what they were?
Well, the one thing I'll say with some of these repayment plans is like there is a use for all of them. So there is a use for all of them. And the reason I say that is like I'm quite concerned with physicians right now that if things go really poorly for all these different IDR plans, some physicians, especially attendings, might struggle to access PSLF at all. So let me explain what I mean by that. So the pay and the IBR plans require somebody to have a payment that's lower than their standard tenure plan to be able to get onto it. And the save and repay plans do not require that. They require just anybody can pay 10% of their income, whatever it is, no cap. And then the ICR plan basically has a cap that's roughly equal to like a 6-year payment amortization, but anybody can get onto it. What I'm concerned about with all these different plans, let's say that save and repay get blocked by courts in the next few weeks, right? A lot of physicians out there have not recertified since they were in training. So a lot of physicians out there have not recertified their income-driven payment since they were literally back in fellowship or residency, right?
Making, less than 6 figures.
Paying $300 a month or something. And if
Yeah.
you're on one of these uncapped plans, like the save plan, or if you're on the save forbearance,
Mhm.
if those plans get whacked and you've got to go back to IBR, if you're making 300,000 a year and you've got 200,000 in med school loans, you might not have partial financial hardship. You might not have a payment that's lower than your standard tenure plan. And with the ICR and the pay plans being blocked to new signups by the Biden administration, that means that somebody might be like 1 or 2 years away from PSLF with no way to get those final months of credit needed to get the loan forgiven.
So the standard plan does not qualify someone for PSLF then?
So here's the problem with the standard plan. If you consolidate, it's the standard 30-year plan, and that standard plan doesn't count because it's not the standard 10-year level of payments. So it just doesn't count. You can't really pay up to what it would have been. It just doesn't count, basically. And the standard 10-year plan, and here's something that's really nuts. I used to always think, well, if somebody had not consolidated, you could just point somebody to the standard 10-year plan and they could get PSLF. But if you
Yeah.
actually look in the regulations very carefully, it says that the standard 10-year plan is supposed to be amortized according to how much time left you have in repayment, with 10 years being that max number. So in other words, if you, let's say, have been in the COVID forbearance, so you have 4 years of payment credit, instead of the standard plan being the standard 10-year plan, your standard 10-year plan would actually be amortized according to 6 years instead of 10, because
Mhm.
you'd have 4 years of credit and repayment already. And
Right.
so that's a major problem. So if you're an attending physician and you have 8 years of credit with 2 years left to go and you have not consolidated, they'll actually amortize that standard 10-year plan to a 2-year amortization. And so they'll
Oof.
tell you that your payment might be 8,000 or 9,000 a month, which would make you pay off the whole thing. Now, this is the first time that I really even noticed this was a few months ago, which is terrible to say, but the truth is we have not had people in repayment for so long, and the old servicers did not really follow the regulations very carefully. Looking at those regulations, we got some people with payments and it was like projected they were going to pay 9,000 a month. And I'm like, what? That doesn't make any sense. And so then I looked more carefully at the regs and I was like, oh my gosh, these new servicers that were not managing any loans before the pandemic looked at the regs, interpreted them the way they're written, which does suggest that your standard tenure is amortized over the remaining length of your term. Essentially, like I said, would completely block physicians from getting PSLF if save and repay and all these, plans that were created since the Obama administration through executive action were overturned. And that's why the Biden administration, I think, is going to make a last second attempt at reopening the pay and the ICR plans, because at least, a physician in that circumstance would still be able to access a plan that, like ICR, that might be a very high payment, but they still would be able to qualify for a qualifying plan for PSLF. And everything kind of depends on the courts in the next few weeks.
Wow. So that's really anxiety inducing, I'm
Yeah,
sure, for a lot of
I'm
people.
just telling people honestly here.
That's very important information. Tell us about these court cases and what's been happening and why they were brought in the first place.
Yeah, so the cancellation proposal was about a $400 billion proposal that Biden proposed around 2022. The IDR and the PSLF waiver were programs that maybe cost in the neighborhood of 50 to $100 billion. At least that was their estimate. They never really even came out with an actual estimate that the CBO did. So people ignored it. That's why nobody paid attention to the IDR and the PSLF waivers, where they just counted all this credit kind of retroactively and waived a lot of the normal rules. And then
Mhm.
the cancellation program was so transparently big and expensive that Republicans noticed. Republican state elected officials brought a bunch of different lawsuits. A lot of people brought different lawsuits against these plans, and they had success. And then the SAVE plan was projected by the Biden administration to cost around 100 something billion, but that was assuming cancellation succeeded. And
Hmm.
then cancellation did not succeed. And so then the projected cost of the SAVE plan was more than cancellation. It was projected somewhere between like 400 to 600 billion dollars. So it was even bigger than the cancellation cost, because the cancellation plan failed and it was just, that marginal cost on top of what the cancellation would have been. What happened is that plan was supposed to go into effect fully in July of 2024, and that final rule was published in the official register. And once that final rule was published, Then some Republican state elected officials essentially took that same playbook they used to stop cancellation and they used it on the SAVE plan. And so they brought a bunch of different lawsuits. One of them is in like the 10th Circuit Court or got appealed up to there. That's brought by a bunch of state agencies that own debt before 2010 that would lose interest income from the Biden administration's actions. So that's how they have standing. The lower court judge in that case was like, well, not all of it's illegal, but some of it's legal. And he was an Obama appointee. And then the other court case went through the 8th Circuit. That's one of the most conservative appeals courts in the country. That lower court judge, who actually also happened to be an Obama appointee, said something similar, that the SAVE plan is partially illegal, but maybe not fully illegal. The very conservative appeals court is where the lawsuit's at currently. This is the lawsuit everybody in the student loan side of things is worried about, because this lawsuit could take down a lot more than just the SAVE plan. It could take down basically everything that has been done on student loans for income-driven repayment. It could take down all of the plans that have been created since the second Obama administration. So pay, repay, save, all of those could get blocked potentially. And so that's the concern. That's what could happen. And effectively, the reason it's happening is because the SAVE plan was such a big program that the opponents of that program decided they wanted to try to bring it down. And one of the ways to bring it down would be to make the argument that the law that President Obama used to create, these sort of new different plans that weren't spelled out in the law is an illegal law. They're using that to try to take down SAVE, but it could have all these unintended consequences, I think, that the Republican plaintiffs are not even aware of.
So you're saying that save, repay, and pay are all on the chopping block.
Could
right?
be.
What do you think is the fate of the PSLF program as a program? Do you think that can stand in the Trump presidency?
Yes, I think it actually not only can stand, it will absolutely stand. So that's one bit of good news that I've got today, is that the PSLF program is really safe. And the reason is because they frankly did not gut the filibuster. If the filibuster had been overturned, as some kind of were hoping for, especially during that first couple of years of the Biden administration where they had unified control, then PSLF would definitely be overturned. The whole reason why it won't be is because you've got to have 60 votes in the Senate to change big programs. And PSLF is a big program that meets that threshold. If you wanted to get rid of the PSLF program, you'd have to have 60 people in the Senate that would agree, 60 senators. And so that means you'd probably have to have, depending on how the final Pennsylvania race goes, you'd have 7 or 8 Democratic senators to sign on to that. And that's too high of a number. They won't do that. So the combination that's safe is IBR with PSLF, because IBR is spelled out into the law exactly what it is. It's very specifically defined. So IBR plus PSLF is totally safe. Any combination besides those two is potentially not safe at the moment. So at least we know that IBR and PSLF is safe, though, for sure.
Now, are you talking about the new IBR or the old IBR?
Both of them. So there's technically no differentiation between old and new IBR. They don't even call it that. They just say IBR is this if you borrowed after July 2014, 10% of income, 20 years for private sector, and then 10 years for PSLF. And then old IBR is 15% of your income with 25 years in the private sector till forgiveness and 10 years for PSLF. So the IBR program is essentially the pay program. It's essentially pay as you earn for the new IBR program, that is. So that's great. That means new IBR for most newer physicians is really codified into the law. And so that's not something that Democrats are just going to give up. They would have to, get enormous concessions out of Republicans to be willing to give up that new IBR program or to modify it. And so that's another reason why PSLF and IBR are so safe, is because during the Affordable Care Act era is when they got all that codified. And so that's why it's not changing anytime soon, because you've got to get the 60 votes in the Senate, which at the time the Democrats had that, right? Which is extremely rare that one party would have that many Senate seats. So they were able to do a lot of things that are very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of. So that's one bit of great news for physicians, is that, IBR, PSLF, that combo is totally safe. You do not have to be worried about that. That's one thing you don't have to worry about.
Well, fantastic. Unfortunately, they still have to prove partial financial hardship, right, to be an IBR, like you mentioned before. Can physicians file separately from their spouse to qualify for IBR?
Yeah, they can, and they can do a lot of other things. So you could potentially file an extension for your taxes to make sure you have a lower return used for the calculation of your payment. You can file separately to exclude your spouse's income from the calculation. Certain people in certain types of states, like California, can do some interesting things with their income to split it in half across each spouse. And then, we're thinking through some potentially different types of novel strategies that might be able to be used for physicians who do not have that partial financial hardship as attendings that could potentially be affected by these court cases. We're losing access to these uncapped plans. One idea we know works is simply taking a new job. Because if you take a new job in between the period of your old job and your new job, you make $0, right? So you would just simply need to enroll in the IBR program if, let's say, all the other plans were blocked to you. In between jobs, you could just apply for the IBR program and then get enrolled with having that partial financial hardship, and then your payment gets capped. And the cap on IBR is the standard tenure, regardless of how long you've been in repayment. So let's just say you are, in some big city. I'll pick on Philly because I've spent some time there, right? And let's say you're at, Temple as an attending, and then let's say, you're on PSLF, you don't have the partial financial hardship. Let's say you quit Temple, take a month off to travel, 2 months off to travel, recharge your batteries, right? Get enrolled in IBR, and then you're taking your job at Penn. And then now you're still at a qualifying institution, you still get credit towards PSLF. That's not something that physicians have to do currently. Just want to be clear about that. But I will say
Yeah.
this, I guarantee that if hospitals notice physicians start quitting their jobs because of PSLF, I guarantee you they will notice that. So I think that one thing that I would be positive about too is the power of PSLF and the power of the physician lobby surrounding PSLF. It's a very powerful lobby. There was a big change during the Biden administration where Kaiser Permanente physicians that previously could not access PSLF became eligible for it due to the insertion of a random provision in one of the new rules the Biden administration created. And that was done through lobbying by the California American Medical Association branch, right? And like the California Hospitals Association branch. I'll say that the people underestimate how strong physicians' voices are on an issue like this because PSLF is something that is fairly narrow in the scheme of what the government does. It's not enormously expensive to tweak the program here and there. I do think that physicians are in an important enough group that they'll still have a lot of things that could happen in a positive way with even potential legislation if physicians do get really hurt by some of these court cases, especially inadvertently. Because, it's clear to me that court folks don't really understand the implications of what they're doing on the PSLF program. They're just sort of using these broad, blunt instruments, and then that might create a lot of problems for physicians. And so just don't forget that you have a very strong voice that you can use to advocate for yourself.
That's an important point. I mean, there are things you can do that are aside from managing your own finances and to lobby and to call your senator, call your congressman, and make your voice heard. It's very important to make that happen so that you can advocate for yourself and your peers. So, I think physicians leaving a job in order to qualify for IBR, I don't know how many people will do it though, because it's so difficult to leave a practice,
Well,
patients.
we have some other ideas. We have to think through the gray areas and how they seem if they would pass muster. So another example might be, well, what if you took a leave of absence? And is that a period during which your income is considered to be zero if it's unpaid leave of absence? So there's a lot of questions, right? The gray areas of how could you create a partial financial hardship for yourself in order to sign up for IBR? Because once you're enrolled, you're fine because then the payment cap just exists. And if you make too much of your next tax return, your payment's capped. So I think it's all about how do you get a low enough AGI to show what I mean by partial financial hardship, by the way, is not that you're hurting. What it means is just that your required payment on the IBR program is less than a standard tenure. So to do some quick math for people, if you have a 200,000 medical school loan balance, 1% of that is roughly equal to the standard 10-year payment. So 1% of 200 grand is about 2,000 a month. So if your IBR payment is lower than 2,000 a month, you have a partial financial hardship, you qualify. If your payment is over 2,000 a month based on the IBR formula, you do not have a partial financial hardship, you would not qualify. So that's what I mean by partial financial hardship. It's not what it sounds like. All these terms sometimes sound like something and it's not actually what it sounds like.
It's
Yeah.
just a formula the government uses. And yeah, so that's very important to know whether you'd qualify or not. And I know Student Loan Planner has calculators on your site that will help you calculate the payments under each plan. So there are physicians right now that haven't made payments on their student loans for some time now because of COVID. And then, because of the court cases, everyone in SAVE is on forbearance. Do you think they should be trying to change payment plans from SAVE to IBR?
I think that anyone who's positive that they have a payment that's not intolerable on the IBR plan and somebody who was sure they want to go for PSLF should absolutely switch right now. So studentaid.gov/IDR. IDR is an ID as in dog R. So that's the thing to go to on the student aid website to switch. So you should switch and get onto IBR if you know you're doing PSLF, because ultimately there's this thing called PSLF buyback. And in theory, this period of forbearance that a lot of people have experienced during the final months of the Biden administration, that could be bought back when you hit 120 months of total credit. And then you could not have to worry about this period not counting. But I don't know if that's a rule that's going to survive a second Trump administration, PSLF buyback. And if you are really close to the end, very close, like 3, 4, 5 months away, then I think that I might trust that program, that PSLF buyback program, to just get yourself over the finish line. But if you're like 1+ years away, I think those are the folks that really need to entertain switching to IBR right now, because you want to get that credit towards PSLF and not have to ask permission for it later. You want to just know that it counts, and you just want to know that you're building that credit. That's what I would recommend to physicians out there that are worried right now is, you can do something about it actively. If you're not on, one of the qualifying plans, and let me say some people are on the pay plan. And if you're on the pay plan, that's also like a reasonable thing to do to stay where you're at until we know what's going to happen with these court cases. So the key thing is just to not panic. If something really traumatic happens or there's an emergency or some big problem, right? The key thing to start with is just don't panic. Don't make the situation worse. And what we saw a lot of during that first Trump administration is that's what people would do, is people would sometimes make irreversible decisions like refinancing out of an anxious position. And we just don't want to see that repeated. Be very calm in your decision making on student loans.
Yes, absolutely. And high amounts of debt and a lot of uncertainty, governmental regulations certainly increase anxiety. It is important not to make huge money decisions when you are anxious. Wait for things to calm down. You can wait a day or two, take a couple of self care days, really think it over, think about what's happening, listen to this podcast, look at all of your options. Now, just to make sure I understand clearly, you said so if you have 3 or 4 months left in PSLF, can you use PSLF buyback today to buy those payments back?
Well, once you're at 120 months, and it's actually pretend that as if the forbearance does count. So
Mhm,
as soon as you think you have 120 months of something,
mhm.
apply. And then when they reject you, say, "Can I do the buyback?" And
Ah,
I think that this will probably last at least until February, March. I mean, probably longer than February, March, because what happens is it takes a little bit for a new administration to get people appointed, for those people to show up to the office, for them to be able to reverse things, right? They're going to have regulations on like immigration and trade and those kind of things and EPA stuff. They'll have those ready on day one, but I don't think that they'll necessarily have the Department of Ed regulations ready on day one, if that makes sense. I think that that's why people have a little bit of time on PSLF buyback, but it's also the kind of thing where I would say if you're, looking at a late 2025, 2026 type of forgiveness date, then you need to be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more oriented towards, well, let me make sure that I qualify based off of my own actions, not based off of, an administrative program that may or may not be around in a year.
you also mentioned switching to IBR. We talked about that. So are those switch applications being processed right now? Do you see them going through?
No, not by and large. The thinking as to why is I think that the people at Department of Ed expected Vice President Harris to win.
Mhm.
And I think that they expected that they had plenty of time. And they also did not want to yield on the SAVE plan because it's under active litigation and to start processing a lot of these switches. In their minds, SAVE is legal, SAVE isn't going away, and so why would they process switches that then would have to be reversed in short order back to SAVE and cause people to pay more monthly payments? But I think now all those folks are, I guess, just sort of shocked or dealing with the reality of the election results, right? And what it means. And I think that those folks are going to, in short order, start processing those switches again. I think Department of Ed people are smart and they know that save is toast. I think that we're going to see a lot of executive actions probably occurring. My guess would be between Thanksgiving and Christmas timeframe, because I think that they just want to have a little bit of time to digest, how do we do this? How do we take actions? And then how do we do things that don't look like they're an obvious reaction to Trump winning, where we're telegraphing exactly our concerns, right? So I think you're going to see things quietly done over the next few weeks that might help people.
Speaking of Department of Ed, there has been talk about axing the department altogether. Do you think that's something we need to worry about?
So actually, what they've really proposed is axing it and merging it with the Department of Labor. So they've not even actually proposed killing it off completely, right? Like in their mind, it'd be the Department of Labor and Education, or Education and Labor. And if you think about the way the House is organized, or the Senate, the HELP committee, I think it's the House Committee on Education, Labor, and Pensions. So in other words, in their mind, Congress is already organized this way. Why not organize it the same way? If you listen to what they have problems with over Department of Ed on the Republican side, it's federal control over education. They want to devolve that completely to the states, right? Obviously they talk a lot about the, quote unquote, war on woke. So their priorities are not the PSLF program. Their priorities are just things that apply to a lot more people and things that would impact a lot more people. So in terms of student loans, I'm not worried about that, because they also have to have the authority to do that. And that authority would come from Congress, and Congress would certainly have to provide probably a filibuster proof majority to do something like that, or you'd have to get Democratic senators on board, and that's not going to happen. So they propose the same thing in the first Trump administration. Actually, Republicans have been proposing to eliminate Department of Education for decades. So this is not new. And that's one positive about politics, is you can look at the past and say, well, past performance kind of is a little bit of a telegraphing of future results in a lot of ways, right? Like we've seen a lot of these types of political movements in the past in American history. A lot of times filibusters kind of historically over the past 100 years has been a problem for some things, but it's also slowed down some things that might have happened. People get frustrated with the pace of change in Washington, but sometimes that's a thing that can help people like student loan borrowers, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, like Morgan Housel says, history is just the same dang thing over and over again.
Over and over again. Yeah, like exactly. Like there's a really interesting TikTok of George W. Bush actually talking about the isms in American history. Like, I think he said something like, nativism, protectionism, and something else, right? And if you look at American history, that's happened many times, over the past many, many decades. And so I guess I'm sort of in the camp that student loan borrowers, I mean, obviously there's other things to worry about besides student loans, right? But as far as your student loans go, you might have to pay a little bit more. That actually is true, but I would think of it like a slight income tax increase, because, maybe you're paying 15% of your income instead of 10 on PSLF. But because of things like the PSLF and IDR waivers that happen, because of things planning on your taxes, being really aware of how you file your taxes, you can have the hit on your actual income be very, very small.
So, in what situation would you advise someone to actually refinance and pay off their loans? Because, like I mentioned before, a lot of people haven't been making payments and may have been putting that away in the eventuality that they actually need to pay their loans off. When would you advise someone to refinance and pay it off?
If you are tired of dealing with all this, with the caveat that you should not do it if you're going for PSLF, right? You just need to tough it out if you're going for that route. But I think that what I said sort of in the past is like, if you have an income that's greater than your debt and you don't work in the public sector, pay it off. And some people out there, would go for forgiveness if you're in between a 1 to 2 times debt to income ratio, even in the private sector, especially with the old rules like pay, new IBR. There's a lot of primary care physicians out there that should go for forgiveness, even in the private sector, frankly, just because the math makes sense. What I tell folks is if your income is greater than your debt, pay it off. If your debt to income ratio is 2 times your income or more, go for forgiveness no matter what you're doing. This is as an attending, take your attending income, right? And then if you're 1 times to 2 times debt to income ratio, the answer is it depends. And it
Yeah.
depends on things like your risk tolerance, your preferences, your career plans, your financial goals. It's just sort of depends on a whole lot of things, because you might be able to do really complex things that make forgiveness still viable in that range. Things like maxing out retirement accounts or setting up a DB plan, or, getting a lot of write-offs if you have a practice. And
Yeah.
then PSLF people pretty much need to go for it all the time because you can get a capped payment even if you have a very high income relative to your debt.
Well, that's all really good advice. Thank you so much. And I want to remind our listeners that if you want a specific breakdown on your situation, Travis and Student Loan Planner do provide this service. So, Travis, where can they find you if they want to pursue this with you or just learn more about student loans in general?
Yeah, studentloanplanner.com. So that's the best spot to go. Calculators, tools, help if you need it. And just want to thank the listener for listening to this podcast. This is an incredibly valuable podcast. More people need to be sharing voices from physicians in medicine, particularly female physicians. As I mentioned, I'm married to one, and I know that people really need that diversity of voices. So just keep listening to this podcast here. It's very valuable stuff.
Thank you, Travis. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate your time and coming on. And thank you for all your support. And thank you for what you're doing, because we need voices like you that understand the political landscape and know the details and can run the numbers. So glad our listeners have you as a resource. And let's remind everyone that, again, all of this is manageable. If you're anxious, if you're feeling really freaked out, this is not the time to make big decisions. Take a few days to think about it. Take a few days to process. And that's what everyone in the government is doing right now, too. So it's okay. And hopefully this podcast will provide you with some guidance on options for what to do next. Thank you again, Travis, for sharing your insight and expertise. I know our listeners will find this very valuable. Make sure, if you are finding this valuable, that you are sharing it with your friends, sharing it with people that have student loans that might benefit from this podcast. Thank you again for tuning into this episode of Finding Financial Freedom with the Frugal Physician. Have a good day, and don't forget, stay frugal, y'all.
The content shared on this podcast should not be taken as individualized financial advice. We are here to share our knowledge and experiences, but it is crucial to consult with professionals such as accountants, financial advisors, or attorneys who can provide personalized guidance based on your specific needs.